Part 2. Cardinal Directions. Chapter 6. The Pirate King. Had I known of the adventures that lay before me, I might have jumped for joy, but in that moment I could only stare slack-jawed as the harbour slipped away before me. It was then my gaze fell upon a single face among the hundreds crowding the docks, that of Father. Already too far to cry out to him, I could only watch helplessly as he gave a final resigned shake of his head and melted back into the crowd. It was the last time I would ever see him. I suppose at that moment I could have jumped overboard and easily swum ashore, but by the time I came to my senses, the ship had already cleared the mole at the harbour mouth. A horn blared, and I saw the pilot boat peel away and turn back towards Dundee. The forest of cranes and masts soon vanished behind a veil of haze, and after the last marker buoy rolled past, nothing remained but a thin white line of the ship's wake and a great grey emptiness. Now nothing lay between me and the cold waters of the English Channel. Except the lighthouse. The Bell Rock lay just ahead, less than a mile beyond the marker buoy. If I jumped just as we passed the shoals, I could easily swim the distance. The irony of my predicament was not lost on me, having spent 3 long years thinking of little but escaping that place. But as they say, the devil you know. I opened the porthole and craned my head through. The lighthouse lay off the larboard bow, less than half a league away. Twisting and straining, I forced my shoulders through the narrow opening until my body jutted from the hull like some misplaced figurehead. I had only to release my hands and drop gracefully into the water below. But as I glanced at the grey waves churning beneath me, I suddenly lost my nerve. Visions of that stormy night on Bell Rock came flooding back, and in a blind panic I writhed and thrashed until at last I fell free and landed on the deck in a heap. I lay there for a long moment, panting like a dog, until a shadow falling across the porthole announced the passing of the lighthouse. I scrambled to my feet and watched as the beacon disappeared into the fog, and with it my last chance of escape. Cursing my cowardice, I sank back to the floor and pondered my next move. Perhaps if we passed another ship, but I quickly banished this thought. Too many things could go wrong. I needed a boat. But those would be on the main deck, in plain sight. Thankfully, I knew a thing or two about being invisible. Father had made sure of that. Not wasting another moment, I padded silently up the stairs, pausing before each deck to crane my head through the hatchway. Strangely, the ship appeared deserted, and for a moment I wondered if I hadn't stumbled aboard the Flying Dutchman sailing her eternal patrol. It was not until I reached B deck that I encountered the first signs of life, a cook in a greasy apron carrying a steaming cauldron down the corridor. I waited a few moments for him to pass before resuming my climb, and at last emerged onto the main deck. In my panicked flight from the police station, I had barely glanced at the ship I'd chosen as my refuge. Only now did I see what a miserable specimen she was. She was small as freighters went, barely 300 feet from stem to stern, with a single smokestack and cargo crane. Every surface was caked in rust, over which had been slathered untold layers of paint in a losing battle against the ravages of time. From the mast flew the French tricolour, and the wheelhouse bore the ship's name in faded black letters. Cardinal Richelieu, Marseille. But there was no time for sightseeing. I soon spotted the 2 lifeboats stored amidships, and, seeing not a soul about on deck, crept over to the nearest boat and began unbuckling the straps that secured it to its storage cradle. Suddenly I heard voices and instinctively dropped to the deck. From beneath the lifeboat I spotted 2 sailors leaning against the rail not 10 yards away. How they hadn't seen or heard me I could scarcely imagine. As I waited for them to leave, I glanced astern towards the beacon, now little more than a faint throbbing glow in the thickening haze. Not having a compass, I had to get the boat into the water before the light vanished entirely, or I would be lost, adrift in the middle of the channel. Precious minutes ticked by, yet the sailors gave no sign of leaving their post. Though they stood with their backs to me, one errant glance, one slight turn of the head, and the game would be up. As the glow of the beacon grew fainter and fainter, I felt the paralyzing hand of fear and hopelessness closing its cold fingers around me. And it might well have taken me, had it not been for 3 words of hard-won wisdom which suddenly flashed through my mind. Break it down. Back on Bell Rock, whenever my chores grew too daunting, rather than tackle the burden all at once, I would break it down into smaller, more manageable tasks, each task thus furnishing a satisfying victory. The task before me now was no different. First, the straps had to be undone. Then the boat had to be lifted on its davits and swung over the gunwales. Finally, it had to be lowered into the water and the rope falls cast off. There was no need to remove the boat's canvas cover. All that matters was getting it into the water. My plan laid out, and my courage restored, I set straight to work. The straps were easily unbuckled and thrown clear, but the davits proved a different matter entirely. Like every other piece of metalwork on the ship, the winch was caked in rust and whitewash, and when I tried the handle, the gears emitted an ear-splitting screech. Once again I dropped to the deck and held my breath, but mercifully the sailors did not stir. What to do, I wondered. Even if they went below, the moment I began turning the winch, they would hear that almighty racket and come running. They were a nasty-looking lot, all ragged beards, dark eyes, and sinewy arms covered in tattoos, the kind who'd as soon cut your throat as look at you. God only knew what they'd do to me if I was caught. It was some time before the realization struck me. I didn't need the davits at all. If the falls could be detached, the boat could simply be pushed over the side. The ship was already heeling in a light chop. If I pushed just at the right moment, gravity would do the rest, and all too quickly for anyone to stop me. I reached for the shackle which fastened the block and tackle to the boat's prow, pinching my fingers around the knob of the clevis. I winced as the sharp flakes of rust sliced into my thumb, drawing blood. Gritting my teeth, I strained anew against the clevis, but to no avail. It was rusted shut. Once again, my escape was thwarted before it had even begun. In a moment of pure frustration, I let out an almighty curse. There are moments in every man's life when his back is to the wall, when there can be no retreat, no escape into the safety of mother's arms, when the only way out is to charge forward, headlong into the fray. As the sailors glanced behind them in confusion and their eyes met mine, I realized that this was such a moment. In an instant, all my careful plans evaporated, and throwing caution to the wind, I leapt to my feet and lunged at the winch. An ungodly shriek filled the air as I wailed on the crank, the sailors staring agape as the strange spectacle played out before them. With an arthritic creak, the boat lifted clear of its cradles. Abandoning the winch, I turned round and threw my full weight against the hull, but the craft held fast, the davits creaking stubbornly in their rusted sockets. I needed a running start. Against every instinct, I turned and ran towards the sailors, coming nearly face to face with them before wheeling round and sprinting back. As I lunged onto the boat, the davits at last gave way and the boat went swinging over the gunwales, arcing high before swinging back and slamming into the sailors, scattering them like ninepins. As the sailors lay dazed on the deck, I lifted a corner of the boat's canvas cover and crawled inside, groping blindly for a knife or hatchet with which to cut the falls. But my hands met only rotten thwarts before suddenly someone seized my ankle and began dragging me from the boat. My arms flailed wildly, desperately seeking purchase. My hand clamped around something round and hard, but it immediately gave way. It was an oar. As I continued to slide backwards, some animal instinct suddenly took hold of me, and I wheeled around and hurled the oar like a javelin, striking my attacker between the eyes. As he crumpled to the deck, something flew from his hand and landed on the canvas. It was a knife. One of those folding sailor's type with the broad blade and a marlin spike. Immediately I snatched it and began hacking away at the falls. At that moment, another sailor lunged at me, but a slash of the knife sent him reeling backwards. Again and again he came for me, but each time I fended him off, winning a few seconds between each parrying slash in which to cut at the ropes. Strand after strand frayed and snapped until finally only one remained. I swung back the knife to deliver the final blow when suddenly I felt a sharp tug on my ankle. I slashed blindly, cutting a deep gash across the sailor's face. With a sharp cry he released me and staggered backwards. In that moment I realized my wildest swashbuckling dreams had come true. I was actually fighting off pirates. With a euphoric grin, I raised my arm anew and in one clean motion sliced through the last strand of rope. Too late I realized my dreadful mistake. In slow motion I watched the boat, still hanging from the other davit, fall away beneath me and crash against the hull. My heart rose to my throat as I became weightless, plummeting towards the grey waves snapping like hungry sharks below. I had a sudden vision of myself sinking, plunging through the waves and into the icy depths, down, down, beyond the reach of the sun, into the black abyss where the monsters lurked, ever deeper until the cold hand of Neptune closed around me and an icy torrent of salt water gushed into my lungs. Then nothing. Darkness. But suddenly I felt myself wrenched back, and I landed back on the deck with a painful crash. Dazed and winded, I gazed up at a scene straight from Treasure Island. The men standing over me were the spitting image of bloodthirsty buccaneers. One wore an eye patch, another an iron hand, and yet another clomped about on a wooden leg. They looked down on me with a mixture of murderous rage and confusion. Mais d'où qu'il vient, lui? One growled. Je ne sais pas, putain. Doit avoir embarqué à Dundee, said another. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec? On le jette à l'eau? Mais non, on va au capitaine. Mais il a dit, on va au capitaine. I knew they were speaking French, but so ragged were their voices I could hardly make out a single word. Suddenly they seized my arms and wrenched me to my feet, and in stony silence marched me across the deck. I felt like a condemned man being led to the gallows, and when I saw the gap in the rail ahead and the coil of rope lying on the deck, my heart began to race. Was I about to walk the plank, I wondered, with mounting dread? Or worse, be keel-hauled? I lived in mortal terror of keel-hauling ever since I'd first read of the dreadful practice in Father's books. First, a cable would be looped beneath the ship's hull and the ends tied to each of my wrists. I would then be thrown overboard and slowly dragged down and round the keel. If I was lucky, I would merely drown. More likely, I would be cut to ribbons by the barnacles encrusting the hull. Only my flayed skeleton would emerge on the other side, to be thrown overboard to the sharks and gulls. Desperately I writhed and thrashed, but my captor's hands were like iron manacles, dragging me inexorably towards my doom. But then, at the last moment, the sailors veered away from the rail and led me through a hatchway at the base of the pilot house. Down we marched along a dim, grimy corridor until at last we reached a door, at the sight of which the sailors suddenly seemed to change. Their hard faces grew wary and fearful, casting nervous glances at each other. Finally, the man with the metal hand approached the door, hesitated for a moment, then knocked twice. "Quoi?" a voice bellowed so loud it made the metal walls ring. Capitaine, the sailor mumbled. Je sais que t'as dit de ne pas. J'ai donné un ordre strict de me pas déranger, the voice barked back. Oui, mais capitaine, on a trouvé un clandestin. There was a long pause, followed by the grinding of the lock. Finally, the door swung open to reveal an imposing figure. He was the very vision of a pirate king with crimson breeches, knee-high leather boots, and a long blue greatcoat covered in brass buttons. Crowning this regal attire was a face so severe it seemed chiseled from stone. From his chin, a copper beard jutted to a sharp point, like a spearhead poised to strike. And amid this geometer's construction of acute angles were set eyes of the deepest blue I had ever seen, the crystal blue of sea ice. In my travels I have seen the timeless bronzes and marbles of antiquity, and will swear to my dying breath that the captain was descended from old Agamemnon himself. "D'où qu'il vient?" he said at last. "On ne sait pas," said the man with the wooden leg. "On a trouvé en train de voler la chaloupe." The captain glared at me, eyes burning with cold fire. "D'où venez-vous?" he hissed. I gaped at him like a landed fish. Though I was fluent in French, I had only ever tapped it out in Morse. I had never in my life spoken it aloud. But with my very life at stake, I knew I had to say something, anything. "Mon nom est Edward," I began. "Je viens de faire de Belle Rock où mon père is—" The captain winced, as if my very words were causing him pain. Around me the crew began to jeer and laugh. "Je voulais échapper mon père qui voulait—" "Assez," said the captain, clapping his hand to his brow. "Je voulais me faire— Assez! Assez! Stop!" I fell silent. The captain gave a weary sigh. "You," he said slowly, "English?" I nodded. "Va chercher moineau," he said to the crew. "Pas possible," said one of the sailors, shaking his head. "Il est sous encore, ça va prendre une torpille pour le réveiller." The captain grunted and turned his gaze back onto me. "What you do board my ship, English?" he said. "I'm so sorry, sir. My father wanted to lock me up, and I needed a place to hide, and before I knew it, the ship had started to sail. And I didn't mean to sneak aboard, truly, sir." "Stop!" snapped the captain. "Ralentissez. Slow." I took a deep breath and tried again. There was so much to say, so much to explain. Quaking with fear, I could barely put one word before the other. "I am from Belle Rock Lighthouse," I said, with the deliberation of a message tapped out in Morse. "I was running. My father tried to put me in jail." "Jail?" said the captain, frowning. "C'est quoi ça, jail?" Jail, prison," I explained. "Prison?" he said, his eyes narrowing to slits. "Criminel?" No, I said. "I'm not a criminal, But the captain raised his hand, silencing me. "Ce qu'on fait, capitaine," said one of the crew. "On retourne à Dundee?" "Non," said the captain. "Faut garder l'horaire." As his cold eyes looked me over one last time, I felt very much like a fish on a hook, praying to be thrown back into the sea. Wait," I blurted. I'm a good sailor. I can join your crew. I'll work hard, I swear, and I know the wireless. You know, the wireless? Marconi? Radio?" "Radio," said the captain, raising an eyebrow. Yes, radio. Dit-dat-dat-dat-dit-dat-dat-dat, I said, tapping my finger as if on a signal key. The crew roared with laughter. Je ne comprends rien qu'il dit, the captain sighed. Mets-le quelque part sécuritaire et laisse-moi savoir quand moineau est réveillé. With that, the captain returned to his cabin, slamming the door behind him. Once more, the crew seized my arms and dragged me below into the hold, where I was thrown into a supply locker barely 5 foot square. I lunged at the door as it was slammed shut, but it was no use. I may as well have tried to claw through a bank vault. Desperately, I cast my gaze about the tiny cell, scouring it for a means of escape. But the room was bare, without even a porthole. Only a steam pipe, a small ventilation grate, and a bare bulb screwed into the ceiling. I next turned out my pockets, but found only a single piece of crumpled paper. Recognizing it as the one Father had thrown to the floor back on Bell Rock, I unfolded it and held it up to the light. It was a letter, addressed to Father, the Admiralty crest emblazoned on the letterhead. To Mr. George F. Hawkins. Dear Sir, His Majesty's Royal Navy is pleased to inform you that we have accepted your application for your son, Edward G. Hawkins, to attend the Naval Officer Training Academy. When your son has reached the minimum enrollment age of 15, please complete his registration by enclosing forthwith the full amount of the first year's tuition, being £500, addressed to the registrar at the following address. I felt like a cold knife had been plunged into my heart. How long had I cursed Father's name, cursed the day he brought me to Bell Rock, while all the while he sweated and toiled for my sake. 3 years of thankless sacrifice, and in my ungrateful impatience I had squandered all his hard work, and with it, my future. In that moment, in that lonely cell beneath the channel, everything suddenly became very clear to me. My legs gave way beneath me, and I slid to the cold metal floor and wept as I had never wept before.